Hey everybody, it's the History Teacher. In this episode we'll be considering the Spanish-American War of 1898. By the end of the 19th century, Americans began to look outward and became interested in establishing an overseas empire. Why? Three main reasons can be identified. First, American corporations had grown rapidly since the end of the Civil War. By the 1890s, they believed that, to continue prospering, they needed more customers than just those within U.S. borders. They needed to sell to people overseas, too. American sugar planters in Hawaii and the United Fruit Company, founded in the Caribbean in the 1870s, were especially emphatic about this point. Second, many Americans believed that it was the obligation of white Christian people, such as in America and in Great Britain, to bring the, quote, blessings of Western civilization to the so-called primitive, dark-skinned peoples of the earth. British poet Rudyard Kipling referred to this duty as the white man's burden. A final reason was a book by an American naval officer, Captain Alfred Thayer Mann. In 1890, he published The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, in which he argued that all of the powerful countries in history had been nations with large and strong navies. The United States, therefore, had to strengthen its navy, both to protect the transoceanic canal that was planned across Central America, and to win the struggle between East and West, which Captain Mann believed was coming. Mann also wanted the United States to acquire many island possessions in both the Caribbean and the Pacific. These possessions would serve American ships as rest stops and as necessary refueling stations. They would also be secure sources of raw material and trading outlets for American businesses. Captain Mann greatly influenced both the American public at large and especially the future Assistant Secretary of the Navy and later President, his friend Theodore Roosevelt. By 1900, the United States had risen from 12th to 3rd place in the naval powers of the world. In 1868, Cubans revolted against their Spanish overlords. The Cubans wanted the island slaves emancipated and they wanted self-government. The rebellion ceased in 1878 when Spain promised to grant some of the Cubans' demands. But the Spanish took too long to implement the changes, and in 1895 violence again erupted in Cuba. Another reason was the American Wilson-Gorman Tariff of 1894, which raised import taxes on Cuban sugar and tobacco and resulted in severe economic hardship for Cubans. To quell the new revolt, Spain sent the notorious General Valeriano Weyler, nicknamed the Butcher. Weyler herded hundreds of thousands of Cubans into what amounted to concentration camps, where they died in great numbers from disease and starvation. On February 9, 1898, William Randolph Hearst, publisher of the influential newspaper The New York Journal, published a private letter written by the Spanish minister to the United States, Dupuy de Lome. In the letter, de Lome was severely critical and insulting of U.S. President William McKinley, and the American public was outraged. Less than a week after the de Lome letter was published, on February 15, 1898, the American battleship USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 260 sailors. It had been sent there to protect Americans in the turmoil of the Cuban revolt. Americans widely blamed the Spanish for the Maine's destruction despite lack of supporting evidence. In fact, the current consensus is that the explosion was caused by an accidental fire in the ship's ammunition hold. But back in 1898, "Remember the Maine" would become an American battle cry in fighting the Spanish. In retrospect, these two incidents, the de Lome letter and the sinking of the Maine, happening so close together, made the war inevitable. President McKinley seems to have wanted to avoid war, but the war faction, which included Theodore Roosevelt and Massachusetts Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, overpowered McKinley's reluctance. Although Spain had agreed to arbitrate America's disputes with it 2 days before, McKinley nevertheless asked Congress to declare war on April 11th, which it did on April 20th, 1898. To demonstrate America's honorable aims, the Teller Amendment was added to the Declaration, which stated that the U.S. had no intention of taking over Cuba and would withdraw from there after Cuban independence was won. Embarking on the Spanish-American War was a break from America's traditional isolationist foreign policy. So why the change? One reason was the influence of the so-called yellow journalists, notably publishers Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. They used their newspapers to stoke war fever in order to sell more newspapers. Sometimes the sensational stories out of Cuba were true, sometimes they were invented. But among Americans, the impact was to inspire pity for the Cubans, hatred for the Spanish, and a desire for the U.S. to help free the Cuban people. The term yellow journalism comes from a popular comic strip called The Yellow Kid, which appeared in Pulitzer's and Hearst's newspapers. A second reason for the shift from isolationism was that Americans now wanted the prestige of being an imperial power. For decades, Americans had witnessed the European powers acquiring colonies throughout the world. As American strength and wealth grew, many people desired for the U.S. to show the rest of the world that Americans were major world players too. A third reason was that many Americans sincerely felt pity for the Cuban people in their struggle against Spain, and felt that a U.S. war against Spain would be the humane thing to do. A fourth reason was to protect American investment in Cuba. U.S. investment in Cuba amounted to $50 million, a much bigger sum then than it is now. So many investors wanted the U.S. to intervene in Cuba's conflict with Spain in order to secure American economic interests there. The war itself was brief, lasting less than 4 months. Activity was confined to the Philippines and Cuba. In the Philippines, American Admiral George Dewey easily crushed the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay in May 1898. In Cuba, the Spanish notably clashed with the Americans at Kettle Hill, El Caney, and San Juan Hill in early July. Soon after, the American army under General William Shafter captured the city of Santiago. This forced the Spanish fleet to leave the protection of the harbor there. Once it left, U.S. Admiral Sampson smashed the Spanish fleet under Admiral Cervera in July 1898. Puerto Rico was captured by the U.S. with minimal effort. In August 1898, the war ended with the Treaty of Paris and Spanish surrender. The terms of this treaty starkly showed how far Americans had come from the idealistic sentiments of the earlier Teller Amendment. The main provisions were the annexation of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines by the United States, though the U.S. would pay Spain $20 million for the Philippines. No one asked the people of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines what they wanted, of course. And Spain granted Cuban independence and guaranteed Cuban sovereignty. What has been called a splendid little war was a transformational event. Within just a few months, the United States had changed from an isolationist continental power to an imperial global power, a status it has not relinquished since. Alright, that does it for now. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.